Rudolf Nureyev was one of the greatest dancers the world has ever known. Today we celebrate the life and career of an extraordinary artist who died earlier this year. Nureyev was a mesmerizing performer who defied artistic rules. He was a classical athlete whose unique talent not only revolutionized male dancing, but also won a whole new audience to the art that he loved. His defection to the West at the height of the Cold War and his outrageous lust for life fostered a romantic image that lasted throughout his life. Later this afternoon, we'll be screening a film of Kenneth Macmillan's Romeo and Juliet, which features Rudolf Nureyev in his celebrated partnership with Margot Fonteyn. But first, friends, critics, and fellow artists pay tribute to one of the great stars of the 20th century.
He was a great star, an incredible star personality that came out and grasped the audience and held it. It was a love affair.
A blazing star, a meteor. He inspired all of us, our whole generation, and generations all over the world and to come.
Sex appeal, mesmerizing on and off stage. That's what makes him such a great star.
Rudolf Nureyev was one of the 20th century's most charismatic figures. Adored by millions, he dominated the world of ballet for more than 30 years with his beauty, passion, and athletic prowess. But this god of the dance came from humble beginnings. He was born on a crowded train traveling across Siberia in 1938, and at the age of 3, he was evacuated with his mother to a remote village in the Bashkir Republic. Life was hard. His childhood was spent in grim poverty, and he remembered often going hungry. But at the age of 6, he was taken to the ballet for the first time, and it changed his life.
I saw ballet at the age of 6 first time. Next year, at the age of 7, I saw Swan Lake. And of course, I was flabbergasted, and I knew that's what I'm going to do. I remember when I came to the kindergarten next morning, there's one room with a crystal chandelier and parquet floor. I was dancing away. I don't know what I was doing. They quickly whisked me out and threw into the garden.
This passion for dancing had to be concealed from his father, who wanted Nureyev to follow him into the army. Yet he persisted, and against all odds was accepted at the legendary Kirov School at the late age of 17.
His training at Kirov was essentially in the grandest traditions of classical dancing. And it was a training which was perhaps short for him because he arrived late, but he did, fortunately, become under the tutelage of a great teacher, Alexander Pushkin. And Nureyev's temperament was such that he must have absorbed so much from Pushkin that he probably gained more out of his relatively short time as a student and a dancer, then many another artist there would have gained in twice the time.
At the end of his course, he went to a competition in Moscow and amazed everybody with the way he danced, including the corsair pas de deux, which later became one of his signature pieces in the West. So it was no surprise that he got offered a contract with the Kirov Ballet in Leningrad, and principal ballerina there, Dudinskaya, who was the wife of the director Sergeyev, wanted to dance with him. He made his debut with the company, partnering the principal ballerina there.
He spent the next 3 years at the Kirov dancing principal roles in the great 19th century classics: Sleeping Beauty, Swan Lake, La Bayadère and Le Corsaire. By the time he went to Paris with the company at the age of 23, he was already one of Russia's biggest stars.
There had been rumors, reports in 1959, 1960 about this extraordinary young man. And when in 1961 the Kirov Ballet came to Paris, Nureyev danced. We heard about this, and we expect him in London.
Paris was a watershed in Nureyev's life, not only because of his huge artistic success there, but also because it gave him his first taste of freedom.
Obviously, he tasted a new kind of experience. It wasn't approved, but he mixed with dancers from the Paris Opera. He went out and savoured the nightlife. He had a wonderful time, not doing what he was told to do, which was always his attitude.
Despite Nureyev's success, his arrogant disdain for company regulations so angered Soviet authorities that they ordered him to return to Moscow on the pretext of dancing at a state gala.
Probably authority thought he's dangerous, we have to better now to send him back to Moscow. And he had an intuition. The last moment, he jumped to the police in airport.
On June the 17th, 1961, while waiting at the airport, Nureyev handed himself over to the French authorities. The Kirov went on to London without him.
And the next day, we've been in London. And I remember holding newspaper and this headline of these big portraits of him, headline, Rudy Defection, sensation. And as especially for us, for Kirov Ballet, to see that they were so down.
It was the height of the Cold War. It was a time when we really did believe that there could be a war between the Soviet Union and the West. I mean, it was not just sort of vague. And this was just before the Cuban Missiles crisis. It was just after the U-2 flight. And Russia was in many ways ahead of us. So it was an enormous shock when this handsome, gloriously mysterious man from the East decided he wanted to come to us. It was a boost, in a way, for the ego of the West.
Nureyev's defection caused a media sensation. For the first time, he experienced fame, Western style. But his ambition was to dance. Within a matter of days, he was signed up by the prestigious Marquis de Cuevas company in Paris. After the artistic conservatism of the Kirov, Nureyev revelled in his newfound freedom. He was hungry for fresh experiences in dance and eager to compare his brilliant Kirov technique with the great dancers of the West. He went to Copenhagen to study, lured by the Danes' reputation for speed, lightness and precision. But it wasn't long before London audiences too were rewarded with a glimpse of the maverick star.
Margot rang us up about 3 months later and said, I'm having one of my yearly galas for Benevolent Fund. You know this young man, you've seen this young man. Do you think I should ask him? I know he's having some lessons in Denmark at the moment. And so we said, yes, of course, he'd be wonderful.
There was no news about that he was actually in London or in England, and it was all a bit... We knew something hush-hush was going on before class, and then there was this dancer, I remember, dressed all in black. And slowly as the class went on, you know, word buzzed round of who it was. Of course, he had no English, and he was obviously feeling quite sort of isolated.
He was very wary at that time because the press were following him everywhere. And in fact, he came to London under an assumed name. He was known as Jasmine. And Jasmine went to class, and everybody said, this can't be Jasmine, this must be this fabulous Nureyev, because they could see at once in class at the Royal Ballet, his quality.
We first saw him dance at a gala organized by Dame Margot Fonteyn for the Royal Academy of Dancing. And for that, he asked for a solo from Sir Frederick Ashton. He was no simpleton in knowing what was going to be good choreography. The curtain went up. It was a Scriabin poem tragique. And onto the stage surged this wonderful young man in grey tights and with a tricolour sash. And I think we all knew at that moment we were in the presence of a force of nature.
The whole house was bursting to see this dancer they'd heard about that had escaped, and the curtain went up after a little overture, and there he was standing right at the back of the stage, and somehow the look of him holding the cloak, immobile, and the continuance of the music froze the house. I don't think anyone clapped, as it were. Then we came to this first musical climax, and he suddenly rushed forward as fast as he could, right to the front of the stage, right opposite me, and the whole house went mad. They went, ah, like this. It was a terrific shock for the audience, so much so that he lost his nerve, and he forgot all the steps that Fred had given him. And so he sort of ad-libbed a solo and then picked up a bit that Fred had given him and so on, but it wasn't really the solo that Fred had given him at all.
I saw him, and I thought, well, whatever happens, we've got to get him quickly to Covent Garden.
It was Dame Ninette de Valois who saw Nureyev dance and realized that here was a young man who could be a wonderful Albrecht with her company, and plainly he should be given the company's greatest ballerina, Dame Margot Fonteyn. And so there came these performances, the Fonteyn-Nureyev performances, which excited so much public fascination, public attention. It was an extraordinary concatenation of two remarkable forces. The icon of British ballet, our greatest ballerina, the dancer who epitomized everything that British ballet meant, brought face to face with a man nearly half her age, who was possessed by this demon of performance and, at that time, had an extraordinary romantic presence.
emotionally, technically, physically, in every way they were just meant to meet on this earth and dance together. They appeared to dance together forever. I mean, you couldn't believe they both hadn't sprung from the same school. In every way, it was the most fascinating thing that two people should come from countries so far apart and appear to have been brought up together in a school together. Ideal partnership. They complemented each other, and he came with this rare and wonderful schooling, which was some 200 years old. The closer we saw examples of that, the better, because we were still forming our school. It was a question of two ends meeting together and making a whole. He was a young example of the very old school. She was a middle-aged example then, because she was in her 40s, of a very young school. And the combination was very interesting.
You could see Margot daily blossoming again, a flower, maybe a shrub that has had a wonderful time blossoming, and then its time is almost over, and then suddenly these glorious blooms started to come again because he absolutely made her dance.
They were so very different. She was so very elegant and had been a name for years and years, and he was a Tartar and fiery and passionate, sensual, and Margot was not at all like that, very warm, very elegant, quiet. He was the opposite, absolute opposite. It worked wonderfully.
Certainly her sensitivity, her incredible musical aptness, the grace and decorum of her dancing provided an extraordinary contrast with what Nureyev was. And I suppose they did project the idea of a kind of love affair, which was a useful stage convention, and also which the public longed to believe in.
They were not romantic lovers in the way that Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor were romantic lovers. And yet they were a couple in the world's mind, and they became icons, not just for ballet lovers, but icons for everybody who adored the very notion of two beautiful people together.
One of the highlights of their partnership was Marguerite and Armand, a ballet especially created for them by the British choreographer Frederick Ashton. A version of Dumas's tale of the doomed love affair between a dying courtesan and her ardent young suitor, it poignantly distilled the romantic poetry of Nureyev and Fontaine's partnership.
group in that ballet, and so we watched all the early rehearsals, and even in the studio we knew we were watching something quite extraordinary at the time. And then we did endless performances of it, and you know, extraordinary curtain calls. We were in the dressing room taking off our makeup and leaving, and still the curtain calls were going on. So it was a very strange and exciting time.
The 60s were the golden years of Nureyev's career. Technically, he was at the height of his powers, and physically, he was at his most beautiful.
Well, of course, above all, he had charisma. And this is something you can't learn. You're born with that. The remarkable features he had, those eyes, those cheekbones, and his authority on stage, this authoritative manner of walking, strutting. He had total confidence in what he did.
He did have this extraordinary magnetism that did reach right up into the gods. I mean, as the entire theatre experienced it at the same time. It was a very conscious awareness of himself as a sexual being as much as a dancer, and that though he was doing the most extraordinary pyrotechnical things we'd never seen before, and he was jumping extraordinarily high, he was spinning, he was ending in these beautiful fifth positions, what you were most aware of was him as a man, as a real person with real emotions.
He was my first Romeo, and I never forget that performance, Romeo and Juliet. I was so nervous. But in the minute when I ran downstairs, you know, from the balcony to see him for the first time, and when he grabbed my hand and first look at his eyes, he was so intense, useful, bold, and exciting when I immediately understood I am 14 years old and I'm in love.
This extraordinary sense of physical passion. People said he was like a panther, and indeed there was this sense of an animal energy and, at that time, an animal elasticity about what he did. The spring was very powerful. The whole effect was of some extraordinary, controlled but fascinating passion for movement.
He jumped was not like a dart, a projectile. It was slow. You could see him taking off and then floating through the air. And he had this extraordinary soft landing when he was young. He must have had very flexible Achilles tendons because the shock of the landing was immediately cushioned. He went through his feet, absorbed the shock so that you got this feeling of softness, of an animal jumping and taking the shock and moving on. And then followed by incredible pirouettes that he could control so that he would slow them down when he wanted to or speed them up when he wanted to. It didn't always work. I mean, part of the excitement was that he would take the most tremendous risks.
All sorts of people from all walks of life would be absolutely fascinated by him. We had amazing scenes in Floral Street with people queuing around the block to get seats. People would follow him all over the world. When we had seasons in New York with the Royal Ballet, people, some of the most dreadful fans, too, who are in absolute pain, would follow over there and be pestering Rudolf. He got fed up with a lot of it. I mean, they were an absolute nuisance. And all over the world, people flocked to see this man. Why it was is hard to define. Partly, I think it was because he was had this extraordinary physical attraction. I think it was also because he was outrageous.
Loved all his social life, and the grander they were, the happier he was. And the first time he was invited to Kensington Palace to have lunch with Princess Margaret. He got dressed about 5 times before he left, and then he ended up, he'd bought a new pair of boots, which I'm sure everybody must have seen photographs of him in these long boots, you know, so he looked a bit like Puss in Boots. And that was the first time he wore them. He was so proud of them, I didn't have the nerve to say, you know, I think you look awful. But I suppose he had a sort of a fashion all of his own, really, Rudolf. And he did most of the time dress very badly, I thought. But he had a look about him that was especially him. It was a lot of fun, and it was very exciting being with someone like him.
Okay, Rudolf. Here, sign your name.
At times, his taste for excitement landed him in trouble, but this only served to fuel the Nureyev myth.
Do you have anything to say about it at all?
How do you feel about it?
How did you get
I think most
involved?
people will want to know this. Will you dance this evening? Do you have any plan? You can talk to us about it?
Are they treating you well?
In all his activities, whether it was sort of climbing on roofs or being caught with drugs which he didn't actually have, or whatever he was doing, he was newsworthy. And his work was always wonderful. He never let that go down. He was, I mean, whatever time he went to bed or didn't go to bed, he was always in class the next day.
He would rehearse for hours, over and over again, with just what he wanted to do on the night. For Rudy, if he wasn't performing at night, he would go to any other company that was in town, any dance company, every dance company, and after that he'd go to a film. I mean, he really needed 60 hours at night and 110 in the day. He never stopped.
With this extraordinary energy, Nureyev was able to shine not only as a dancer, but also as a producer and choreographer. In 1968, he mounted his own production of The Nutcracker, in which he, as the prince, partnered the ballerina Merle Park. His choreography married the nobility of his classical training with a fresh psychological interpretation of the story.
loved it. It was my favorite nutcracker. We had another nutcracker, which I think is the one we use more, which was done by Sergeyev, the Russian ballet master from Leningrad. But for me, the best nutcracker England has ever had was the one Rudy put on for us in London. I prefer it to any other. I loved it.
Although Nureyev was a classical dancer born and bred, he was always avid to give his body new challenges, and during his career he moved way beyond the familiar territory of academic dance.
It was characteristic of Nureyev, I think, that he sought every sort of choreographic experience. He worked with, I think, every major choreographer of his time.
When I came to the West, the idea was not just, here I am, the best, the greatest, or whatever it is, and let me show them, but I came to learn. All modern choreographers, what they aim is really discovering a new way of moving, a new language. And of course they have that language allows to delve into one's inner being. More complex things could be portrayed on stage.
It is enormously to Nureyev's credit that he was insatiable both for work and for experience, and for the new. There's an extraordinary wisdom about his art, in that he knew that he must go on, he must seek ever fresh challenges. He could not go on just through that dreary parade of princes that some male dancers have been forced to perform for the length of their careers.
Interesting as a contemporary dancer. He could never not be riveting to watch, but he wasn't totally convincing, and so however much he tried in choreography by Martha Graham, by Murray Lewis, even Glenn Tetley, you were never really persuaded that he was a natural modern dancer, a natural contemporary dancer. It was always a very beautifully classically trained dancer attempting a different style. Taylor's Oriole, for example, which was Taylor's own role, he didn't have that massiveness, that naturalness of a big athlete playing around. You always knew that he was in control, that he couldn't lose himself. Though nowadays dancers are expected to move fairly freely between classical ballet and the contemporary modern dance styles and so on, there is still very much a difference in approach and in training. And the two sides can't quite disguise the difference, that a classically trained dancer has a very upright carriage, and rolling on the floor is deeply unnatural to a ballet dancer, so it always feels slightly clumsy, rather tense, as though they're aware that they're going to hurt themselves.
He was the first classical dancer, well, one of the first, to break through that barrier that existed between modern dancers and classical ballet dancers. And of course, I suppose coming from Russia, he wanted to experience all types of dance, which was marvelous. And he did us a great service, because now ballet dancers do modern dancing, and you know, it's no longer sort of another world.
The range of roles Nureyev danced was breathtaking, as was the number of his performances. He appeared in works choreographed by some of the biggest names in 20th century dance, including Maurice Béjart, Glenn Tetley, Roland Petit and Martha Graham. He was greedy for experience. As he loosened his association with the Royal Ballet, he performed with companies all over the world. And though a dancer's career is usually short, he seemed to push his body on and on.
But if you're going to be honest with yourself, how long do you think you can keep dancing at this sort of pace?
Well, I guess the thing is, everything comes to an end. Alas, say alack. And, well, when it comes, it will come.
Do you see that end yet?
No, I don't.
He always attended class, and he rehearsed and he worked and he performed and performed. I don't know how he did it. I know of no other dancer ever who has done so many performances in such that sort of space of time.
Nureyev worked and worked and worked and worked. And work was his crusade, his salvation, his identity.
Nureyev felt most alive when he was performing. A showman, as well as a dedicated artist, he seemed to relish his occasional flamboyant excursions into television and film.
Don't tell me, I know. You're fired.
But fun and games apart, ballet remained sacred to Nureyev, and from 1983 to 1989, he was director of the Paris Opera Ballet, where he mounted several new productions, including his Hollywood version of Cinderella.
He did many productions of the big classics, but based on Petit Pas, most of them. But the Cinderella there, he did create completely, from beginning to end. And he had this wonderful idea about setting it into the 30s, into this world of Hollywood, with all those films, and before this, between 20s and 30s. And he had all this, he did a lot of research on the old movies, Charlie Chaplin, and all these very old movies, Buster Keaton, and all these people.
This new role as producer and director didn't spell the end of Nureyev the dancer, and he continued to perform in many ballets and in many guises.
I think the invitation to become director of the ballet at the Paris Opera was an enormous stimulation to him. created an amazingly wide repertoire. He brought in, for the first time, proper productions of the old Russian classics. He revived works from the French historical past, which had been overlooked for many years. He had new works created, and he found a way, without neglecting the established stars of the company, to give chances to the youngsters. Sylvie Guillem, she must have been about 16 or 17, and already he had marked her out, and she was dancing principal roles.
Nureyev's final production for the company was also the last ballet he ever staged. An old Russian classic, La Bayadère was both a homage and a return to his roots. After the ballet's premiere, the cast gathered on stage to salute the man who had devoted his life to their art. The French government honoured his genius by making him Commander of Arts and Letters. It was to be his last curtain call. Three months later, Rudolf Nureyev was dead.
Undoubtedly, Nureyev's influence on the ballet world on the last 50 years has been simply incredible. And it'll go down in history. He will go down in history as one of the big figures of this generation.
The core of Nureyev's being was his love, his belief in classical academic dancing, his burning desire to worship it as you have to worship it in public, in the theatre.